Dr. Samita Sen, who's kindly joined us today. She is a professor at the Faculty of History. She's also an alumnus of Trinity College. She's studied here for a PhD as well as a research fellowship before. And she has, amongst several great achievements, researched extensively on colonial South Asia, and she's also very active in participating in the women's movement in India. So today she'll be talking to us about the impact of colonialism on women in India. And without further ado, I'd like to pass on to Dr. Sen.
Thank you, Rishi, Nishant, Nikita. It's a great pleasure to be here and to talk to you about something I've been working on for many years now. And because I will be focusing on the women's movement today, because I will do this in a historical way, so I wasn't a participant in the women's movement in the period I will be talking about. But I have been, since a very young age, a participant in the women's movement in India. So I have a special interest in looking at its history. I will have a PowerPoint, so I will try and get that up. Yeah. So the title slide has been I've chosen the title partly because it is common to speak of Indian woman in a singular fashion, as though there is some kind of homogeneous notion of an Indian woman. Nothing could be further from the truth. In fact, it is almost impossible to say Indian woman in any meaningful way. There is such wide differences, and this is not just regional or class differences, it is also differences in social locations, in cultural attitudes, in how people look, think, dress, in a variety of ways. There is very, very sharp differences among women. And it is not only, we routinely nowadays talk about increasing inequality. And this is true of many parts of the world. And it's true of India as well as many other parts of the world, that there is increasing inequality. But as I said, this is not only inequality, it is diversity as well as inequality. So we have to keep both those frames in our mind as we talk about the Indian women. So this is, it is also true that the colonial period is, the historiography of the colonial period is dominated by the notion of the nation and the emerging notion of the nation. And a great deal of historians' work focuses on the incipient imagination of the nation and how people resisted colonialism with the notion of the nation. So nationalism is a framework for the understanding of this period of history. And to take nationalism as your framework, very obviously then the appellation Indian becomes relevant. And it is also gives a false idea that the nation somehow captures within its frame all people, in this case, all women. So both these frameworks I will be careful about, and to make, to draw attention to issues that are not so commonly addressed, instead of looking at the process of this unification or nationalism, I will in fact look at how the process of unification happened and then how that changed. It is widely known that this history begins with a movement that is normally called the social reform movement. And it's roughly spans the 19th century. So from early 19th century, there are two sharp landmarks. The beginning is supposed to be the abolition of sati in 1929. And the end is supposed to be the age of consent legislation, which is 1891. So 1829 to 1891 is considered to be the height, the peak of social reform. And interestingly, though it is called social reform, in fact, almost everything about this social reform is about women. And even more narrowly, a great deal of this social reform is about marriage. So if, I don't know, I can see the windows, our windows in front of the pictures. But if you can see the pictures, then the person at the top is Rukmabai. And the one next is Raja Ram Mohan Rai. So Raja Ram Mohan Rai is supposed to be the person who drew the attention of the British to the practice of sati. The practice of sati is the practice of burning widows in the funeral pyre of their husband. So if your husband dies, then when he's being cremated, the widow is cremated alive with the husband's body. That was the practice of sati, and it was supposed to be voluntary. It was supposed to be that the wife voluntarily gave up her life, immolated herself with her husband. But in practice, you can well imagine that, especially with young wives, this was often attended by considerable violence. So this was something that the British noted, and they wanted to change it. And then Ram Mohan Rai came, and he gave the push that enabled the British to prohibit it. And then we have another series of reforms. The widows were not allowed to remarry, especially among the upper castes. That was legalized. Then we had Jyotiba and Savitribai Phule in Western India, who popularized, not only tried to give widows shelter, but also did address lower caste women and women's education. Malabari was a Parsi reformer. He addressed the question of child marriage. There were several other issues as well. There was female infanticide, etc. So many of these issues revolved around the question of marriage. And the other major issue of the time, and that was actually the one which had huge consequences, was women's education. So you'll be a little surprised perhaps to know that the first women graduates of the British Empire were not in Britain, but in Bengal. In the 1880s, two women became the first graduates of the British Empire. Kadambini Ganguly, who later went on to become a doctor, who's the left-hand side picture, and the right-hand side picture is Chandramukhi Basu. She did a master's and then went on to become the principal of a college, the women's college in which she herself studied. So this was, so modernization in a sense went on fast forward in the colony. Things that had not been possible in the metropole in Britain itself suddenly became possible in the colony. So women not only got modern education, they became doctors, they practiced Kadambini practiced as a doctor all her life. They took up many other professions. They became teachers, they even became lawyers. So by late 19th century, in a 50, 60-year period, the first graduates are in the 1880s. So by the late 19th century, you actually have professional women. And in 1885, the Indian National Congress is established, and Kadambini Ganguly, for instance, but other women become members of the Congress. So from marriage, from being saved, from being burnt in the funeral pyre of your husband, from that very medieval, barbaric sounding social reform, in a very short period, you have not only modern education, degrees, employment, professionalization, and political participation. You can imagine this was an enormous trajectory for women to take. But these women were very definitely part of the middle class. And this process that was taking place, like in many other parts of the world, was a process by which the women were being incorporated. So it was part of a process of class formation in which middle class women were being created as middle class women. But this was not, so this was not the only process taking place. Not all women had these advantages, nor did all women, nor were all women able to walk this long and very, interesting path. The path, the daughters of the social reform movement, these are our grandmothers, our great grandmothers. We have inherited this from that time and that process. So what happened to other women? And this is interesting because, in fact, lower down the social scale, women lost more than they gained. So if these are women who gained from modernization, there were women who lost from modernization. So poorer women lost many things. They lost their autonomy in marital arrangements, as precisely the social reform movement, which gave middle class women more autonomy, better marriage conditions, better family conditions. The same laws actually harmed poorer women. They also lost employment in a big scale. So there was a huge, this was a time when there is a secular devaluation of women's labor across the economy. They lost their traditional livelihoods like spinning and food processing, and they were not given jobs in the new modern sector. So like factories, you had mills, you had mines, you had plantations. Only in tea plantations, women got equal, more or less equal share. But in mines and in factories, in mills, in construction, in docks, women were not given jobs. So poorer women found themselves out of the old kind of work they did, but without any new kind of work which had become available for men in the new economy. And one consequence of this, which is a very dramatic, had a very dramatic impact and is still an ongoing process. You see that consequence even today in India, is the prevalence of dowry. So before, in the late 19th century, more people paid bride price. Fewer people paid dowry. By early 20th century, the picture had reversed. Now more people began to pay dowry and less people paid bride price. And it's a process that has gone on through the 20th century. By the end of the 20th century, you have very, very, very many more people paying a very, very higher amounts of dowry than ever before. So the very fact of dowry, in fact, shows how women's economic value has eroded in the long term. Now, so social reform and shifts in marriage system then had opposite effects on two groups of women. For one group of women, you can defer marriage, you can have late marriage or not marry, you can have education, you can have employment, you join the elite. And for another group of women, you in fact have more draconian marriages from which you cannot exit. Your labor is not valued, you can't leave and do your own thing. So you are in many ways, you are disadvantaged. This obviously class difference is also has overlaps with caste. So there is the elite are not only rich, they're also upper caste. And the poor here are not only poor, they tend to be, though this is not exactly coeval, but there is a strong caste dimension to this story of class divergence. Now, it is in this context that you get the beginning of the women's movement. So while there is divergence and women are being, the social and economic processes are beginning to create inequality, more inequality, there is a political initiative taken to try and articulate women's interest. So women are no longer just, so in the social reform movement, women are articulated as a social category. So women are identified as victims of social practices, and the colonial state is trying to protect or rescue women from these social practices. But from the early 20th century, in most of these, except a few cases like Rukmabai, like Jyotiba Phule's wife, Savitribai Phule, you don't see women speaking out themselves. The most of the architects of social reform are men. They are doing it for the benefit of women. They're rescuing women, they're protecting women, they're doing good, and there is no doubt that they do a lot of good. But it is still a men's view of what is good for women. It is from the early 20th century that women, the inheritors of these reforms then begin to speak for themselves. And Indian women are able to say what they want in their own voice. The first really important name in this respect is Pandita Ramabai. She begins to write, she travels, she speaks, and she is articulating a very new kind of vision of what the modern Indian woman will be. And she is ably followed by Sarala Devi, who's also called Sarala Devi Chaudhurani, who starts in who joins political movement in the late 19th century, the proto-nationalist movement. By early 20th century, she forms this women's group called Bharat Shri Mahamandal in 1910-11. And she in fact says, she is a member of the Congress, she joins the Congress, but she says that men will never, ultimately men's interests are in conflict with women's interests. So men will never take the final steps in the liberation of women. So you cannot expect that the Congress will bring about a social revolution. If women have to be free, if women have to go ahead, then they have to have their own organization. And this is the statement with which she starts Bharat Shri Mahamandal. And at that time, another statement that women are making, many educated women are making, is that we can no longer accept the old Shastras. We need new Shastras. So it was like a rejection of the so-called traditional patriarchal social norms. In this modernist trope, three women's organizations are established. Again, the pictures have become hidden. So the first picture is Ramabai. The middle picture is Sarala. At the bottom are Margaret Cousins and Annie Besant. These two are the women who founded the Women's Indian Association in 1917 in Chennai. This was followed by the National Council of Indian Women, which was formed in 1925, which was formed by very elite women, some princesses, queens and princesses of begums of various principalities, and the Tatas, Mithun and Mithi Tata, were very prominent leaders of the NCIW. And this was the one organization which actually did a lot of work in fighting for women's suffrage. So women's suffrage movement in India was considerably less prominent than in many other parts of the world. And I'll pick up the thread of suffrage towards the end of my presentation. But the most important organization, women's organization, was the All India Women's Conference in 1927. Now these three are the three most important women's associations through the colonial period. There has been many criticisms of these organizations, and the most important of these criticisms is that they were elite institutions. You can imagine, I mean, the members were queens and princesses and the Tatas and all that. But they were not the only members. AIWC was a very large organization. And in fact, it needs to be said and it needs to be remembered that AIWC was the second largest organization in India in the colonial period. After the Indian National Congress, AIWC was the second largest organization. And it was modeled on the Congress. So it had a national office, and then it had provincial offices. It came down to the district level. And you had AIWC members in villages as well as in metropolitan, in the big cities. So AIWC was a very big organization, and certainly it did not comprise only the elites. The second is that while AIWC's campaign issues were included a lot of middle class issues like child marriage, education, suffrage, right to property, right to divorce, marriage reform, all of that, which were seen at that time at least as middle class issues. These were not the only issues the AIWC tackled. The AIWC also tackled maternity benefit, wages, equal wages for women, improving conditions for working women, which were actually typically working class women's issues. And in fact, it should also be remembered that much more than trade unions in that period, it is women's organizations which espoused, campaigned for working class women's issues. So trade unions focused on common working class issues, but did not address gender issues within the working class. Whereas AIWC actually did address working class women's issues. So those two things should be remembered. While it is true that there was an elitist bias in many of these organizations, this should not be the last word in our evaluation of them. So they mobilized on social reform issues as well as civil and political rights. And obviously, nationalism was a very big agenda. And we will come to that in a minute. The early period of this women's movement, especially under AIWC's leadership, was one of remarkable unity. And so AIWC is established in 1927. In 1928, immediately after its establishment, there is a big social reform campaign. And that is around what is called the Sarda Act. It's called the Sarda Act because the person who brought the bill to the legislature was a man called Harbilas Sarda. So after his name, Sarda, it was called the Sarda Bill and then became called the Sarda Act. In 1928, 1929, in that period, there was a huge campaign around the Sarda Act. What was the basic contention of the Sarda Act? It wanted to raise the age of marriage by 2 years, from 12 to 14. That was it. But it became hugely controversial because a section of the population, elite population, not poor people, did not want raise the age of women's age of marriage, right? Girls' age of marriage, because it's from 12 to 14. So there were lobbies among the elite who did not want the women's age of marriage to be raised. And it is AIWC which gave this campaign leadership. And without Sarda alone would not have succeeded in getting this act passed because there was so much opposition. And there was at this time, there's a very interesting book by Mrinalini Sinha, which is called The Spectres of Mother India, in which she actually shows how the polarization happened. Because around this time, an American woman journalist called Catherine Mayo wrote a scathing indictment of gender relations in India called Mother India. And that angered nationalists, a whole range of men in Indian politics so much that they were opposing any change in anything to do with women's condition. But AIWC's leadership, in fact, brought together warring factions. It brought together Hindu and Muslim, because the Muslim community was saying that you have to exempt us from this law. Some other communities were saying we don't want to be part of this. So the bringing together these different groups was a remarkable success. And it is their campaign. Many historians who've looked at this period have argued that it is their campaign which actually allowed the passage of this act despite a lot of controversy. So this was one very significant moment of unity and of success that followed from that unity. The Child Marriage Restraint Act got passed in 1929. But immediately after that, in the 1930s, there was, and this is why I call this division, diversity and division, that it seems that if you look at Indian history in the colonial period, you see that various kinds of processes of building consensus, creating unity, breaks down when, because of the heterogeneity of interests, because it is such a large country, because there are so many axes of difference. It's not only class, but caste, region, language. There are so many differences which pull people apart. And in a sense, there are many issues that pulled women apart after that one moment of unity. And I've listed the factors on this slide. There is communalism is, of course, the most important. So the most important division in this period is between Hindus and Muslims. So after Sarda Act, there is very clearly a division. Muslim law reform goes on its own trajectory. Hindu law reform goes on its own trajectory. There is no longer a meeting ground, even for social reform among Hindus and Muslims. And then, of course, partition happens, and that's another story which we can talk about if you like. But even nationalism, which is supposed to unite, also became a force of division. In the 1940s, you'd know that in 1942, after the war began, Gandhi gave the call for Quit India. The August movement in 1942 was the British, Gandhi gave the British notice, you now quit India. Karenge ya marenge was his slogan. And part of this Quit India call was total non-cooperation. And he said that no, the Indians will not cooperate with the British in any administrative matter. Now, this became very complicated for women, for the AIWC in particular, because just before that, the Rao Committee had been appointed. And the Rao Committee was going to undertake the reform of Hindu law, which basically meant family law. So now, if the women AIWC refused to participate in this process, then all their demands of like 30 years would be dissipated. They would not be able to represent their demands to this committee, which was going to rewrite the law. And so Muthulakshmi Reddy, particularly, who was a doctor in Chennai and a front-ranking nationalist leader, she said no. She said to Gandhi, you have to exempt this from non-cooperation. We have to represent our interests to the Rao Committee. But Sucheta Kripalani and Mrinalini Sarabhai, others who were more dedicated to Gandhi's cause, they said no. Whatever nationalism comes first, law reform can be handled later. If Gandhi has given a call, then we don't cooperate with Rao Committee. So that divided AIWC down the middle. One group of people followed Gandhi's call. One group of people resisted Gandhi's call. So that became later a very serious division. And then you had left, the emergence of left ideology, and one group of elite women, middle-class women, changed allegiance. So people who had been radical, people who are called terrorists, radical nationalists, many of them shifted to communism. And there were two major movements in this time, two peasant movements led by communists. One was in Bengal called Tebhaga, and one was in Hyderabad called Telangana. Now you know that there is a state called Telangana. So these two, Tebhaga and Telangana movements, involved women both as leaders and as participants. So leaders, middle-class women who moved away from nationalism, mainstream nationalism, to lead peasant movements and peasant women who were participants in these movements. So this was not against the British. It was against landlords and elite Indians. It was also against the British in a way, but in a distant kind of way. In fact, Telangana movement was against the Nizam of Hyderabad. And his, so it is, so these movements complicated, and women's participation in these movements complicated the political map in which women were participants. Then, of course, you had independence and partition, and then followed in 1950. Sex, caste, everything was, no inequality was to be allowed. So there, in the fundamental rights in the Indian Constitution, you had an equality clause, and you had universal suffrage, universal adult suffrage. Before many countries in the world, including European countries, Indian women got, adult Indian women got the right to vote. Now, this has been, many commentators have sometimes said that Indian women got the vote without fighting for it. And this is untrue. This is a wrong way to portray the story. First, as I said, there was a suffrage movement. The National Council of Indian Women did fight along, though less prominent than the nationalist movement, a fight for women's suffrage. But also the AIWC's support for the National Congress was premised on this understanding that we will, so when Nalini Sarabhai and Sucheta Kripalani supported Gandhi, they also had an understanding with Nehru that if women postponed their battle after independence, if they were going to subordinate their interests to the interests of the nation, they would be rewarded with a deal. The deal was that we will put our shoulders to the fight now, and we will not raise uncomfortable gender questions, but equality and suffrage were the non-negotiable condition. So it followed then from women's participation in the nationalist movement, that this minimum gain women made at independence. But of course, communist women pointed out that this is meaningless because, and which proved to be true in the long term, that the suffrage did not give women equality, nor did a sentence in the Constitution give women equality. So they adopted a slogan of 40s, which is that this freedom is false. Yes, it's a false freedom. And around this slogan, left women created a federation, which is called the National Federation of Indian Women in 1954, which said that the fight for equality has to be carried on. And we can't rest on our laurels. But for a very large proportion of Indian women, it was like the fire had been put out. I had come out of the house because my house was on fire. Now the fire has been put out, I can return home. So by and large, the battle for women appeared to have been won. It was only much later, in the late 1960s, 1970s, really, that women, apart from this National Federation of Indian Women, that you then got a second wave. Like in many parts of the world, you had a first feminist movement which ended with suffrage, and then you later had a second wave. In India also, we had a first feminist movement which ended with suffrage, but you had a second wave after about 20 odd years. So it is the second feminist movement which addressed questions of diversity and division much more directly, much more upfront than the first feminist movement did. But the first feminist movement was also conscious of and ridden with diversities and divisions. And the last thing I will say is that diversity and division in the Indian context should never be seen negatively. It is through diversity and division that many kinds of interests are represented in Indian politics. And diversity and divisions enrich our politics rather than detract from it. And I would so say that when I put diversity and division in my title, it was not meant to signal negativity in terms of my evaluation of the women's movement. Rather, it is the enrichment and spread, extension of the movement that I wanted to signal. I'll stop there.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Sen. Your presentation was brilliant. It provided some great, unique insights on the women's movement and how it progressed throughout India and the various factors impacting women during the time. So yeah, if we can just open up for any questions. If you want to ask a question, you can either drop it into the chat or alternatively raise your hand and I can unmute you. Or you can unmute yourselves and then you can ask your question to Dr. Sen. So first question we have was from Jasmine. So thanks, Jasmine. And the question is, what was the impact of religion on the oppression and liberation of women in colonial India?
Yes, this is a very big question, and it's very difficult to answer this in the space of as an answer to a question. But briefly, religion is central because, as I said, the whole issue of social reform as it began was an interrogation of religion. It is they were reforming laws, but these were not laws that were unconnected to religion. So sati was a Hindu practice, not just a social practice. So because how people lived, because families, women's marriages, women's position was so caught up in the way in religious prescriptions. So any attempt to change any of this came up against religion. So religion was absolutely central. And this is also the notion of tradition and how tradition was to be interrogated or changed or not changed or celebrated. All this was very much caught up in religious identity, which is why communalism becomes such a deep fissure in Indian society by the late 19th, early 20th century.
Great, thanks. I hope that answers your question, Jasmine. Any other questions?
Hello, hi. Thank you very much for the talk. I really enjoyed the talk. There was one question I had, which was that you mentioned that towards the the end of the 19th century, for some women, like the situation was improving a lot, but then for some it was getting worse. Could you elaborate a bit on like why that was the case? Was that due to linked factors, or was it two separate driving things?
No, I mean, that is, I would say they were linked because they were part of the processes of class formation. So in the same process that defined the elite also defined the lower class in a sense. So for instance, let me take this one example, a widow remarriage. When Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagar argued for, Vidyasagar was not the first person arguing in favor of widow remarriage. The whole agenda had been there for a while. The British were saying that give us evidence that widow remarriage is allowed in Hindu law, and then we'll pass the law. And a lot of people were arguing that Hindu law did not allow widow remarriage. Now, this debate was happening as though Hindu law and the applicability of Hindu law was only to upper castes, because only upper castes did not allow widows to remarry. The entire middle to lower caste Hindu population already allowed widow remarriage. Okay, so when then finally Vidyasagar, that famous incident, Vidyasagar found a quotation in Parashar Samhita, and he then gave it to the British, and on that basis the Widow Remarriage Act was passed in 1856. Along with the Widow Remarriage Act, to address the conservative opposition, the British also passed a linked act, which is called the Hindu Women's Properties Act, according to which law, if a Hindu widow remarried, then any property she inherited from her dead husband, she lost. It went to the husband's next kin, next heir. Now, this created a huge problem because in many lower castes, women did inherit their husband's property, they did remarry, and they took their property, husband's property, with them into a new marriage. And that whole thing had been cut down. So you make a law that is in the image of upper caste practice, and then you apply it to lower castes, where you don't have this practice. So in fact, lower caste widows lost a right that they had previously to these laws. So that is why I'm saying they're not always linked, but very often they are linked.
Okay, that's really helpful. Thanks very much. And thanks again, it was a really lovely talk.
Thanks.
Do we have any other questions?
I had a question. You didn't mention it, just sort of thinking about, so you're mentioning the role of gender in colonial India. Was there any role of there's a large transgender community, transgender intersex people community in India? Was that ever recognized? Were their rights ever included by either side, or were they represented as one community by themselves?
Well, there is now, I mean, it is only very recently that we have historical research on this issue. And a book has now been published by Hinchi on the one act that was passed in the 19th century on transgender, so one community, transgender is a very modern term. What you had in colonial India, inherited from an earlier time, was various kinds of in-between people. And they were quite distinct communities in themselves. It would be very difficult to put them under one single bracket of transgenders. So one very important community, for instance, you must have heard, is Hijra. Yeah, and they had a distinct identity. They called themselves that, and there was, even within Hijras, there were many subcategories. But so when the British encountered some of these people in the northwest India, they were so totally unable to comprehend what was going on, that they labeled them as criminal tribes and outlawed them. So but that is just one regional process. There were other processes, and the main sort of, I would say that, again, we know very little about this on the basis of whatever little research and whatever sort of my instinct is, that by and large it was ignored. Across the country, many communities of in-between people were not drawn into the mainstream in this period, and the state, they remained outside the ambit of the state. There was social regulation, but there was no state regulations. The colonial state did not specifically, except that the marginal people became more marginalized. That was a basic colonial social process. But other than that, there wasn't any very specific colonial policies.
Thank you. That's really insightful. Thank you.
Great. I'm being slightly conscious of time, so I think we have time for one more question. No? Okay, so I had a question as well. So it was quite interesting how you did talk about kind of overlap between the caste system and the kind of social hierarchy in India and how it impacted women, specifically the distinction between kind of rich elite and the poor. So what was the kind of, was there kind of a clear distinction, or was there kind of a blur when you look at kind of middle class women as well? Like, what were the impacts on them with regards to, you know, marriage restrictions, job opportunities?
Yeah, so when I am saying elite, I mean, I very, except briefly talking about the queens and princesses in the National Council of Indian Women, I'm not really talking about the traditional elite, not the really rich aristocrats. I'm talking about the middle class, which is in this historiography called the new elite, which is an elite which is the creation of the colonial state. And they are the middle sort of people. They are the people who have gained Western education. They have got into the new professions like lawyer, doctor. They have got jobs in the colonial bureaucracy. They are the ICS. So this is the new elite, and this is the nearest you can identify a middle class, because you don't have a very large bourgeoisie. You do have a bourgeoisie, you have Indian entrepreneurs, especially in Western India, but it's very small. So you can't say very much in terms of social processes on the basis only of the bourgeoisie. So it is this wide swathe of middling people who are normally included in our definition of the colonial middle class.
Great, thank you so much. Yeah, if anyone doesn't have any questions, I think we can end it there. So before we end it, I just want to say a special thank you for Dr. Sen. We found your presentation really insightful. I'm sure everyone agrees. Also, a huge thank you to Bath Indian Society for organising, these lectures and allowing us to collaborate with them. And also a special thank you to ProPrep, who have willingly agreed to donate £120 to some of our chosen charities. And finally, thank you to all our participants for finding the time. I hope you find this really useful. We will also be putting the recording of this session on our YouTube channel, so do share this with others who might have missed out on this. But yeah, thank you so much. All right, take care, guys. Bye.
Thank you.